Welcome back to the second part of our panel discussion on the Grid Connections podcast, looking at the year of 2023 and our panel's predictions for what's coming for electric vehicles in the automotive market in 2024. For those of you who may be streaming or watching the podcast on YouTube or other channels, my apologies. I had to record this a little bit later at night, so the lighting for this first intro part and the outro today aren't the best, but for the actual panel, it'll be just like last time, so there shouldn't be any issue there. So continuing where we left off with our panel members, John McElroy of Autoline TV, Lauren McDonald of EV Adoption, and Matt Teskey of ChargeWay, we focus on the increasingly influential role of Chinese EVs in shaping both the North American and global automotive markets. We explore how these vehicles are not only changing the landscape of competition, but also setting new benchmarks in technology and design. Our discussion then examines the pivotal role of software in EVs. We examine software's profound impact on consumer buying preferences, all tying it to the concept of what I like to call a user-defined vehicle. Car design that leverages software first and allows for a specific user to customize the car however they find fit. Something becoming a deciding factor for many younger buyers and in markets across the world. This really allows them to tailor their electric vehicle experience to their specific needs and tastes. And I think that's a big part of where we've seen the success in the startups is really putting this mindset first in car design. However, the transition to software-centric vehicles is not without its challenges. We shed light on how legacy automakers are grappling with integrating advanced software into their electric vehicle designs. This shift from traditional automotive engineering to a software-driven approach presents both opportunities and obstacles for established players in the industry. The panel also addresses a pertinent question in the EV space. Should software recalls be still referred to as recalls, or is a more appropriate term needed? This discussion leads to a broader conversation about the communication challenges most EV automakers face. We delve into how these companies are struggling to effectively convey information and updates to the public about their electric vehicles and associated recalls. Finally, our panel shares their predictions for the global electric vehicle market in 2024. They provide insights into emerging trends, potential market shifts, and what consumers can expect in the near future. Tune into this engaging episode of the Grid Connections podcast to get a comprehensive understanding of these critical issues shaping the future of electric vehicles. Whether you're an EV enthusiast, industry professional, or simply curious about the future of transportation, this panel offers valuable perspectives and predictions you won't be able to find anywhere else. And with that, enjoy. And after hours, you guys talk about this quite a bit about BYD and their competition leaving Asia, now going into Europe. How soon do you think that someone like them is going to make a launch into North America?
Well, we're already seeing Chinese vehicles in the U.S. They're just with, familiar legacy brands.
Right.
But as you guys know, I mean, the Chinese, a number of Chinese automakers and suppliers are just flooding into the Mexican market. And, they're clearly going to use Mexico as their entry into the U.S. market. And they may not have to pay a tariff. There's 27.5% tariff on Chinese-made vehicles coming into the U.S., so that would get rid of that. They may not qualify for IRA money, but their cost levels are such that they probably don't even need it to be able to compete. So NIO has said it will be in the U.S. market by 2025. Look, they're all watching this year's presidential election. If Trump gets in, it's going to be a slow walk of Chinese automakers coming into the U.S. market. But who knows? I mean, there's talk right now of boosting the import tariff on Chinese vehicles to 40%. So even if Biden stays in, there's bipartisan support to keep the Chinese out any way possible. But the U.S. market, even though volume-wise it's smaller than China, it's far more lucrative. You can make a lot more money here than you can in China. And so the Chinese automakers really see no choice. If they want to be truly globally dominant, they've got to be in the American market.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that
I was just going to say, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the Volvo XC30 does. I mean, it's not going to come out till probably middle of the year, or third quarter and stuff. But I think it's going to be sort of a telling moment if consumers even care, like, where the cars made.
They won't care, Lauren.
They don't.
You can already see
Right,
it with.
because
Yeah.
the people that are complaining on social media about Chinese made products are doing it on this device that's made in China.
Right. That's right.
Right.
Well, but let's be very clear and careful about that. Is the brands we're talking about right now, Volvo, Apple, they're not perceived
No, they're
as
not.
Chinese
Right. And
brands
that's
in America. And so NIO, BYD coming to the States, those are fresh brands. And that's going to be something that they do actually have to tackle from an American branding perspective. Is if for any reason that perception is different, it's a fresh new brand that no one's ever heard of. Just because Volvo manufactures a car in China or just because Apple manufactures their phones in China, that's not how Americans perceive those products. They will then all of a sudden, what's BYD? What's NIO? Oh, it's a Chinese brand of vehicle. And it's a fresh brand, and they're going to have that narrative to actually contend with. I don't think it's going to be that Americans are going to go, I don't see the difference. It's like an Apple iPhone. No, I don't think that is going to be
I don't
how
quite agree, Matt.
BYD
Look at sales of the Buick Envision. It's no secret that that's made in China. It sells just fantastic.
It's an American brand. Again, that's my point. Is Apple was founded here in the United States. Volvo is seen as a Swedish brand by most people that drive Volvos. They are not perceiving it as just simply because it was made in China doesn't mean they understand that. Mach-E is made in Mexico right now, and if you ask a Mach-E buyer, they're going to go, "What?
It's made in Detroit.
Is it? Well, it's an American product. It's a Ford. I mean, so this is a brand perception discussion.
Look at the sales success that the Chinese are starting to have in Europe, and I think that's a litmus test for what will happen in the American market.
Europe is
it's not the United States, I know, but just look at sales of MG in the UK. I mean, or Australia.
Right.
I mean, they're off to the races, and
all not America.
Listen. If you come into the U.S. market with a very good-looking car with great technology that is substantially cheaper, Americans are just going to go to it. And if you tell them it's Chinese,
some will. Yes,
I think a lot will.
So we already see Tesla having a problem being an American company with certain segments of the American populace for why they won't buy it. And so that to me, again, it's a brand positioning piece, is those brands like NIO and BYD need to be prepared to contend with that. I mean, that is just
to
a
me,
reality.
This sounds like back in the 70s and 80s, will people really buy Japanese cars? And then, or are they really going to buy Korean cars? And, Americans just tend to go to who can give them the best product at the lowest price.
Or if it's positioned as being something that is actually cool, to be perfectly blunt. Yeah. I mean, I had this exchange this morning on LinkedIn with somebody. They said, well, why do you think that EVs aren't? Why are they sitting at the lot? And I said, there's a variety of factors, but number one is people aren't clamoring in to buy cars that run a new fuel type they don't understand. I'm sticking to it because I think there's a lot of evidence to point to that. But they said, well, then why are Teslas selling like crazy? That means your assertion doesn't make sense. I said, Tesla is cool. They don't actually have a freaking idea what they're buying. They want to have a Tesla. And then they find out after that, oh, God, I have to figure out how to use this dumb thing. And 1 in 5 buyers in California went, I'm done with an EV because I can't figure out how to do this. Americans, by sake of how they consume products, oftentimes are based on FOMO or just this is cool, and they will justify purchases emotionally around those factors. And so NIO, BYD, if they can, from a branding perspective, pull that off, not as a Chinese company, but as a flash and flare, badass new car company, then yes, they will have success. But if there is any element of this is not an American company, in fact, it's from China, and what is China to us? Well, then you get into political ramifications of that. So it's not as simple as just saying, well, like Apple or Volvo, they're going to be fine. I don't think so.
I think this is actually a perfect segue to the third part of this, which is software, because I think you're totally right, Matt. At least for the short term, there is, for the brands that people know that are Chinese and they don't even know the brand, there's going to be a lot of skepticism. But I think John hit it on the head with Toyota, Honda, all these Japanese brands that were coming in the 70s. They had kind of different negative connotations. There were still a lot of people between the price, losing jobs, World War II, that they eventually overcame and are doing very well. I think long term it'll be fine, but the big thing
that took decades in some cases. If we're being honest to ourselves.
But they've got BYD is a company that can make that. It's one thing to say a Lucid. I don't know if they're going to be here in decades. BYD has the volume to battle it out for decades. I think they can do that.
They got Warren Buffett money, baby.
You're right. So then, yeah, maybe centuries. We'll see. But the big thing too then is obviously going back exactly to why do people buy Teslas? Software. They don't know that's why they're buying it, but it's the experience. It's these now like new forms of luxury. And who does software really well in new EVs? Chinese car companies. And I think
that will be, and
that's how they're doing it in Europe.
To be honest,
they obviously don't have, I think, as much negative connotations to American buyers in Europe, but that's how they're winning a lot. Is one, price, and then two, functionality through software. And I think it'll take them longer, but I think we've seen this story play out before, that price along with a better service. I mean, that's the big thing, is just making it easier. Now, you look at some of these Chinese car companies doing like NIO with the battery swapping technology. I don't think that long term is going to take off, but it at least gets the conversation started and makes people open to a different way. They see it's like, oh, they're trying different things. They're an innovative car company. And I think the next big variable in this is generational. I think once you get under 45, maybe even 50, they don't really care too much about whether it'd be nice if it was made in America, or there's the prestige of like, oh, I have a German luxury car. This is fancy, or but once again, they're not fighting in that space. And so I think this is kind of a great way to go into the segment, unless there's anything else anyone wants to say around software being the big thing that EVs and the automotive industry has to contend with.
Oh, software's massive. I think if Apple actually decided to use their war chest to actually build a car, and they put their software in that car, and they leveraged quality batteries, and then said, we'll use the NACS connector, they would have a field day.
Yeah.
But I think that they're also, Tim Cook and others there are being practical around the idea of like, yeah, we don't build cars. That's not what we do. I get that. They're at least being practical in that sense. But if they take their approach to software and put it inside of a vehicle, and it works as it does on your phone or on your computer at home, yeah, they will own a lot in that conversation. And that's where I think that, Google getting into this space, I've met with the Google team that does a lot of what's happening on the automotive side of things. The reality is they look at what they're doing and saying, well, we're building this the way that we know how. And if the auto sector needs it a certain way for what their automotive application is, they need to tell us what that is. But the auto sector, candidly, doesn't know what that is, because they've never been software as part of their core competency. They've always outsourced it. So you have a very capable company relying on the feedback from another company that doesn't have an understanding of what they need to compete with. So there is opportunity for a Chinese brand, whether it's NIO, BYD, or others, to step in and say, well, boy, we do this really well. And if they can package that within a vehicle that is branded in a way that, to your point, Chase, I don't disagree at all, that if you're under 50, 45-ish, you probably don't care. But as you go down in that age group, you also go down in how much they can spend. And EVs don't cost $15,000.
And that's totally true. But I think that is kind of one of the advantages to the Chinese EVs, is they traditionally are being the most price competitive. So
but to what John pointed out, trying to get those things into the States, there's going to be some big hurdles around that.
So maybe this will be the 2027 predictions when we're talking about it more seriously.
Two things on the software side. I think, I don't know if everybody saw the Jim Farley interview back, I think it was in the summertime, where he talked about the loose federation of suppliers, and that they had 150 different, I think that was the number, suppliers, all writing their own software code, right? And it was like, A, the suppliers aren't very good at it, and B, it's all different code and they have to try to bring it together. And so now Ford is moving towards actually writing the code for all of their, components and stuff, versus Tesla and the Chinese, right? Tesla was started in Palo Alto, et cetera, in the heart of Silicon Valley, and they designed the car with a blank sheet from the ground up, hardware and software to work together. The software engineers all work in the same building, et cetera. Well, now they're in two locations, but basically, it was software code that runs everything. And we've seen CEOs being fired of OEMs because of software challenges and stuff. Like, they're just so far behind on that preserve. And then the second point is just really, just as both John and Matt talked about, what have the Chinese been building for the last 20 years? Electronics. They make consumer electronics, right? Hardware and software. Yeah. And when the Chinese government decided strategically that they were going to dominate EVs globally 15 or so years ago, right? They basically invested in all these new startups who did what, right? Made new electronic products, EVs, from the ground up, right? Designing the soft. And so it's like where we have the legacy automakers that are like trying to figure out how all this stuff works together and hire software engineers, something they've never done before, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, they're using a partsman approach as they always have in a lot of ways, and I think I think the example you brought up of Jim Farley, and Chase and I talked about that in the last conversation he and I had. That was a great moment of just candor and honesty around. It's like, look, this is not something that we do right now, and we have a problem. So that's nice to hear that level of transparency. But then it also begs the question of, so what is your solution? And right now, to your point, it still feels like it's like, well, it is a completely, it's a transition of their corporate culture and mindset about how do we go about building our products. And that's like turning the Titanic and missing the iceberg. I mean, that is tough. But to Ford's credit and Farley's credit, I think they among the legacy brands are at least acknowledging this problem better than others. But to your point, it doesn't mean the application of that acknowledgement is being done perfectly, because then you still have an F-150 Lightning coming to market. And Lauren, to your point, kind of scratching your head of like, why wasn't that an Explorer or something else that you guys probably could have sold more of, because your truck buyers are not diving in,
which is so funny to me.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So no, but I think that Lauren, that point is, I think, very big, and the more honesty we can see from the legacy brands around that would be refreshing. But I don't think we're going to see it. And I think there's going to be more of a very bumpy uphill road for a lot of them having to acknowledge and then pivot. And the pivot may not, again, as you said earlier, Lauren, it is reactionary. Yeah. It is not proactive on their part.
It's also why the South Korean companies are going to do well as well, was because they're much more software electronic sort of oriented and stuff, and are newer, right? They have different cultures and can move more quickly as well and stuff. And we're already seeing it with the charging curves on the Hyundai Motor Group vehicles, right? They just crush it. They have the best, sort of charging capabilities.
Oh, well, the way they've approached it from a voltage perspective they were the only other outside of Porsche Taycan and Lucid. They were the first to say, we're switching 800, 900 volt, and we're going to do it differently. I think it's proving to be effective for them. There's some gaps they even have in their own software in cars still. Yeah. I mean, for my friends that have Ioniq 5s and EV6s. But to your point, I also, even from again, I think that branding conversation we were having earlier is they didn't have really any baggage around who they were as a brand going into the EV conversation.
I'd kind of push back on that. Kia especially has connotations of being kind of
cheap. Yeah.
And it still has that with most consumers. Like I was having this conversation. Sure. I mean, we were having this conversation right before the podcast, Matt, about the previous one where it was a consumer who was like, well, that's cool that it can do all that charging.
But it's a Kia. Yeah. When I said baggage, I mean the customers they've cultivated. That's the lack of baggage. Fair. Is they were able to pivot positioning on their brand and frankly to the designs they have. I mean, Ioniq 5, EV6. Most people that see them are like, that's a cool car, and they've done a good job with that. And I think that combined with their technology, and they didn't have to reconvince the public on. Think of us a little bit different. Or hey, you've been buying a gas F350 from us for 30 years. Yeah. How about this electric 150? I mean, I think that helped them in some ways, and they've leveraged that very well.
I think it.
Just one quick sort of follow up anecdote on Kia. I mean, I 100% agree with you, but they're also surprisingly like I have my best buddy is like a long time high end car buyer, right? Porsches. He's got, Land Rovers, etc. And we were texting after the Lucid came out with the Gravity, right? Because he's a big, huge 3-row SUV guy. That's all he buys, right? And he goes, that and the Kia EV9, like, and I'm like, I about fell out of my chair, right?
Whoa.
Right. Was that a quote?
But I think that. I think they have made some successful inroads with more like traditional, like car people, maybe not average buyers. And I think it's like when you think of Kia, and obviously, and John, you kind of even talked about this on Autoline After Hours a couple times about bringing in the former head of M at BMW, making a much more sporty brand. But I think especially between their ICE vehicles and then their EVs, I think the EV side of stuff, they've done a pretty good job of even kind of like how Tesla did. Like, you offer this car, you have 3 different variants. Here's the sport version. And I think this all ties back kind of to the software. And one of the things that on yesterday's episode of Autoline After Hours about kind of how some of the traditional automakers are approaching software that I thought was really interesting was the conversation about like, oh yeah, we've always done software. We've always had people. And that's true from like a vendor standpoint, I thought. But the big thing to me that's made the big difference is kind of what we're talking about here. It's to like the Rivian, it's to the Tesla that's got dog mode. It's no longer taking it to being software being something that provides a function in the background. It is now becoming something the user directly experiences. It's not like, oh, I'm going to change. This is all software in the background that's changing from gears to make the car more fuel efficient that the user never knows about. It's about making it much more actual consumer forward. And I think that's where Tesla, the startups, and especially the Chinese automakers have been very successful in software, is realizing they don't really care about sometimes like this software or this line of code doing XYZ getting 3%. It's like, oh, I have dog mode in my car. And as silly of a thing as that is, that's a new luxury. And this is something I talk about all the time. My wife even says she won't consider a car now if it doesn't have a feature like dog mode. And these are like the new generational and luxury features that the Rivians, the Teslas of the world, and there are other companies doing it. But if they don't have, and I think even the auto industry is, and I'm going on a huge diatribe here, but once again, like Tu Lee, who from Sino Auto Insights, who we've had on the podcast, and I originally came from your program, John, was talking about like the auto industry has now started talking about the software-defined vehicle, and I think that's a big misstep, and I agree with them because it's really about the user-defined vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
software-defined for sure. That's like kind of how you build a system, approach it. But really, if you want to build a car that people are interested in buy, it is the user-defined vehicle, and that means a good app, good features for the dogs or whoever. And that is really what's changing and making, I think, a lot of these car companies that are having challenges with software. And since I realize we're kind of going over time as it is, I think it's time we drop the Chevy Blazer bomb and talk about how they're having their own software issues. And John, I'm curious if there's anything that you can share from kind of being maybe in the Detroit area, or just anything you've kind of heard or your thoughts about this.
No, I haven't heard anything different. I haven't heard anything different than I'm sure you guys have heard. You know, it's a disaster. The whole Ultium program is a disaster. You know, if you go back 2 years ago, I thought, wow, GM, they've got their act together, you know, clean sheet design, totally new from the ground up. I thought by this time they would be leading the charge amongst the legacies. I mean, they're barely a step ahead of Volkswagen and Cariad in this regard. And it's got to be hugely embarrassing. And it comes down to, as you guys know, it's a 110-year-old company. They have 110 years worth of policies and procedures that are not stupid. They're there because they got burned in the past for something and they patched it with a policy or a procedure to make sure that didn't happen again, especially when it comes to safety systems. And so you've got that ingrained in them. And, you know, this is why we'll see if Doug Field at Ford can pull it off. But I think it was smart of Farley to go, hey, guess what? We're not going with any legacy person to run all our electric and software stuff. We're going to the Valley. Somebody who's been at Tesla, somebody who's been at Apple, somebody who started at Segway. And that's what it takes. You need a startup or a Valley mentality to do this. I don't care how good you are as a legacy executive. You can't run it. You just can't do it. You're not, it's like trying to argue that the train companies should have recognized that they were transportation companies. And if they had done that, they could have competed in the automotive industry. And it's like, no, they were great train companies. They were never going to make that transition. And so you're never going to have a legacy automaker successfully transform itself into a software company, which is essentially what Tesla is.
John, I'm just
Yeah. No, I think you just
I'm just curious your thoughts on so Farley came out and divided the company into Model E and Blue, right? But it's fundamentally it's still Ford, right? Like and I would be curious in your thoughts. Something I've been thinking about a lot lately is, everybody bitches and complains about, okay, they're going to lose $3 billion a year in EVs and stuff like that. Well, as you said, I mean, Tesla lost billions and billions of dollars for years. Lucid is going to lose billions and billions of dollars. Rivian is going to lose billions and billions of dollars a year until they get the volume up to, as you said, it's hundreds of thousands a year. And then all that investment of billions in factories and people and getting the thing going, they're going to break even and make a profit. Like, should have Ford actually created Model E as a true separate entity, as a startup, and gone to the capital markets, gone public, raised capital, and bring some people over, but fundamentally create a new company and go to town.
Lauren, I thought that they might do that. And there's two other things that you're probably not even thinking of that would give them a massive advantage of that. If you organized Ford Model E as this standalone electric company, I think legally you could get around dealer franchise laws.
Right.
Yep. And number two, I think you could say goodbye to the UAW and make sure that you set up in an area that is anti-union. I'll bet they talked about that. I'll bet they talked about that in depth and just couldn't pull the trigger.
It seemed more like the way they publicly positioned it was exactly what you're talking about, that it's going to be a separate company. But in reality, it's like Google becoming Alphabet. It was really more for Wall Street.
Yeah, it was really benefits. Like for the CFO to just report two different lines of
right.
That's
and
it.
The instant,
but otherwise, everything's the same.
Because I haven't really thought about it much until the news recently when they were talking about, like, oh, we're going to do hybrids again. It's like, so is that Ford E or Ford Blue, or is there going to be now Ford Hybrid? Or like, what? Where
Ford
does
Gray.
this? It really is become. Yeah, exactly. It's like
Ford Gray.
Ford Gray. Yeah, exactly.
It's in the middle.
Yeah.
Well, I think what we're speaking to is a big part of the mentality that a lot of the legacies have used over, from a communications perspective, and kind of how they position themselves for the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, which is, we are going to come out with a press release that is going to show that we are competing. And then in various ways, as the onion gets peeled back over time, you realize like what level of depth was there into what they were doing. And John, I think to your point about where Ultium has landed, I'll be honest, when Ultium Day happened right before COVID hit, I had plenty of friends that were there. Lauren, I think you were there. And I remember just watching all the news, and I thought to myself, this all looks like fluff.
I completely agree.
Like this doesn't look like, I don't get the sense that there is an embraced understanding of what this is. I feel like this is a very good marketing day.
Exactly.
And I always felt, okay, then let's see the meat on the bone. Like, what's going to happen with Ultium over time? And John, I think you did a very good job of just kind of explaining the painful realities of where things landed at the end of 2023, which is, again, the word used was embarrassing. And I think, to a certain extent, that's kind of just how it has to feel at some point. I mean, I've said this to friends, in the industry for the last year or two, is I'm very over press releases.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear what you're planning on. I want you to show us what you've done. And there's not a lot of that from the legacy side in many ways. And I think it's starting to just, if you don't have substance, people are going to call BS on you.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was surprised most about the Ultium announcement was, like, I saw it. It seemed much more to marketing to me than like engineering.
Look, it was a message to Wall Street.
For sure.
All these executives are compensated on a bunch of different things, right? But one of the things is boosting the stock price. And if 2-3 years ago you said, hey, guess what? We're doing EVs too. Kablamo. You got to pop on the stock price. And so that's what all that messaging was about. But I'd add one more thing too, Matt. I think a lot of these executives have been learning, like certainly I have. As I've dug deeper and deeper into Tesla, there's another, layer to the onion, right? You keep peeling it back and learning more and more. I think if you go back 3-4 years ago when a lot of these decisions were being made, 5 years ago, they didn't know. They didn't know they had to do software-defined vehicles. Just didn't know they had to do that. They were just playing around with digital twins and things like that. Now, they had technical people who knew that, but I'm talking about the people at the top. They know the legacy business inside out and backwards. They had no idea that this tsunami of technology was about to overrun them, and they just haven't known how to react to it.
No, I think you're spot on that. And kind of what I mentioned earlier, that 4-factor aspect of what makes a positive EV ownership or production experience, they really know the inside and outside of the car. That is what they do. But aside from that, they've been mechanical engineering experts for a century. And then they've lumped software as needed on top of that. And then they've leveraged infrastructure from fossil fuels for a century. So they really, to your point, John, they weren't comprehensively thinking about it that way. They were like, we build cars, so let's get a battery and we'll put a gigantic battery in this car, and then we will make it so it starts, and we got dealers that can sell them, and then we'll say, look what we did. It's amazing. Yeah. And to your point, that was so surface level of understanding of what they actually had to be building. Yeah.
And I think that's one part of it. Honestly, the thing that stood out to me was the announcement of the engineering of what they were doing. I was like, so many people were like, oh, this Ultium thing, it's going to change everything. It's going to have all these things. And every time they talked about what the Ultium battery pack was, I was like, there's nothing new here. It's literally cells to modules to pack, and you make a really, really big pack. And that's to me where I'm just like, there's no like that. Everyone else is doing this. There's a reason these cars are so expensive, and all you're going to do is make the most expensive part more expensive. I don't understand that how this is going to disrupt or change. Like, there's so many so many vestigial parts in what the Ultium positioning of what their technology was that I was like, so many car companies have already announced they're moving away from this. How is this going to actually be cheaper, better, more efficient? And unfortunately, I guess I was right. But
and even on the energy approach, we now have an energy wing of our automotive company, and we're calling it our brand blank energy, whatever. And people I know from the energy sector and utilities that have joined some of those teams, when I've had conversations with them, they've said, what's interesting is there's this acknowledgement of, we know we need to be doing this, but they don't fundamentally understand how it fits into the process of what they're building. And it just always makes me think of that old Steve Jobs quote of, we hire smart people to tell us what to do. We don't hire smart people and then tell them what to do. And in that sense, the other problem we see that I've seen at least, is that legacy OEMs are saying, we need to address some of these energy aspects, things of that nature. Let's bring in people that are from that sector that have experience. Well, those people walk in and they say, yeah, but we're not coming out of Tesla. Like, we're coming out of the energy sector. That's what we've done for 20, 30 years. We don't know what they were thinking and doing. We know they're tapping into our world and they're using it as an aspect of what they do with their company's core competencies, but we don't strategically know what we need to be telling you. So I think it's still, John, as you pointed out, it's just this lack of comprehensive understanding of how all that fits together in those layers as they've been peeling it back. And to your point, 5 years ago, they were just staring at an onion.
Right.
Going like, I guess we got to build an onion,
But I think this is actually a really good transition into predictions for 2024, because this is exactly kind of what is kind of the reckoning that we've maybe been seeing in the second half of 2023. John, I know you talk about this on Autoline all the time, like what electric vehicles, autonomy, these were the hot things from like 2020 to 2023. And this second half of the year, there's been a huge pullback. And I think to what you're talking about, Matt, is especially true with the energy side of stuff. Is like, let's talk about this. Tesla's doing it. There's obviously a need for it. Once again, money's cheap. Wall Street really likes this. This will drive the stock price up. And we'll get there eventually and figure it out. We just have to get into the space. And I think there really has been a big reckoning. And we've seen that with GM on the autonomy side for sure. And now it's kind of like they're just, and it's, I kind of don't blame them with how things have gone, unfortunately. They are kind of just like slowly just shrinking Cruise and all this stuff, and I wouldn't be surprised if within a year they don't have it anymore as a part of their business, kind of like how Ford dropped Argo. But that's a whole nother conversation. So with what were you going to say there, Matt?
Well, I think what you're pointing out is let's be very honest about what we're all discussing, in the sense that there's a lot of promise about what technology could be, right? But then there's the practical application of how do we bring it to market? And what do we need to be understanding about how we combine some of these things that have been siloed for a long time if we're talking automotive and the energy sector, energy being utilities, for example. And I think that the way that I've been viewing it for the last 5 years or so is watching a lot of these promises come out. And I think, well, long ago when we developed out the advancement of the automobile and what happened with infrastructure around that, and then outside of that, infrastructure for the energy sector and electricity, those were just sort of getting built out over the last 100 years. And we've got it to a place where a lot has been done to make our existing society what it is with those aspects of how we all live with electricity and transportation. We watched one company understand how to look at those two worlds and blend them. And I think what you pointed out, Chase, about Tesla being a software company first, that's kind of that, what is your foundation of understanding it, right? And I think that the canvas, I kind of say oftentimes, it's kind of like looking at a painting. The painting has been painted. The canvas has been filled in when it comes to transportation and energy. We're now asking these companies that made that happen, reimagine that painting. And they're looking at it going, yeah, we don't know how to paint any differently though. Well, and then Tesla said, but we do. And that's what they did. And so it's like, I don't know how, I think, John, you said it very well in the sense of these companies are not going to be able to just reinvent and reimagine themselves that way. And even if it was, let's spin off this other company and call it a purely brand new company to avoid some of these hurdles we have, whether that's dealers, UAW, go down the list, do they actually have the leadership in place to make it possible? And I just don't see that the visionaries that need to be in place for that are out there that they can just pluck out of nowhere and plop into a CEO or position to make that happen.
Well, I think it goes to what you said earlier. Press releases are easy. They're easier than ever, especially with ChatGPT. Actually designing it is hard, and then building it is really hard. And then there's that whole challenge of having to make money.
And
that's
selling it
far
too.
The hardest.
Matt talks about this a lot. We talk about this a lot. And the third piece is if they can even build them and not have software issues and build them at volume, they have the dealer network that apparently many of them don't want to sell them. But even if they do, they're not very good at it.
Yeah, and that's, I think, once again, that's a whole another
show.
Hour and a half plus podcast. But what I think is really interesting is it kind of goes back to that onion too. It's, once again, was the Tesla and everything they're doing software defined? Yes. That's not why people bought them. They bought them because they were user defined. And I think that's still the last part of the onion. Maybe they're now kind of peeling back and kind of understanding that part. No one's going to buy. And I think the other part of this, as the final software thing I wanted to cover real quickly, was the panel's thoughts on, should a software recall be called a recall, or does it need to be, because not even in the case of Tesla, like Rivian, Ford, all these companies had it. It gets headlines, but it has none of the financial or other kind of impacts that traditionally you see. Maybe it has temporary Wall Street impacts, but from a liability, or like from a reliability and customer experience, that is one of the biggest perks of a software defined and user, from the user perspective of a recall, that I just don't think most people even fully understand. I had so many people texting me saying like, oh, you got to take your Tesla. No, that's crazy. And I was like, and I didn't even know about it. It was literally people texting me about it only to find, oh, I already had the update, I guess. And then after driving 2,000 miles, I didn't notice anything different other than the images were bigger, which I think's fine. But I think that is like going into 2024, such a big difference in that user-defined vehicle that I'm curious of the panel thoughts, like, should that now be a thing?
No, they should not be called recalls. Number one, I can't believe the media's fixation on recalls. We don't even report them anymore.
It gets headlines.
You know why? Because they happen every single day of the week. If you go to NHTSA's website and look at service actions, recalls, it's a constant barrage. And the media sort of cherry picks what it's like. In fact, if you'll notice, most recall notices happen after 5 p.m. Eastern time on a Friday, just so that they miss the news cycle or try to miss the news cycle. And if it's an over-the-air update, who cares? I mean, you don't even know. So I'm with you, Chase. I don't think they should be called recalls.
I think Tesla and Rivian are great SEO for a lot of journalism companies. And so, like, if they can do a headline about it, great. But you look at the companies that have the most, I don't even think Tesla was in the top 10 this year. I had the number somewhere, but for actual recalls, Ford was number one for the third year in a row. And all these other companies that maybe but they're not even companies that have the software OTA availability. And I think a recall should be a thing. It should be called out, whether it's hardware or software. I think it is kind of silly that it's putting the wrong focus on what needs to be done.
I'm going to probably be the outlier of this group in that I think for the moment, right, recall is the term that the industry uses, the government uses, and we need to continue to use that.
Right.
Going forward, do we need to rethink that term or add a sub term under it? Recall software update or whatever it is, because the fundamental issue to me is while we say, like your point, Chase, and I have a Tesla as well. It's like if you say yes to the software upgrade, it just happens. You don't have to take it to the. But if the government thinks it's a safety issue, like full self-driving or whatever it is, it's still a recall, right? Or maybe we use a different term, but it fundamentally the government is saying there's a problem with the car that needs to be fixed. And I think we're like, I mean, it's great for a podcast and social media to argue over whether recall is the right term or not. But it's not about the word. It's the fact that the government has found a problem with the car that they believe needs to be fixed. And so whatever we call it, it's,
I don't think we'd argue on that. I don't know if anyone else thinks. I think if right, and I don't have any argument with that. If the government or someone has said there's an issue, that's a pretty good reason to change something. But I think honestly, one of the other advantages to just calling it out more was one, just to avoid consumer confusion, but two, it might actually be a reason to push automakers to have these software-defined vehicles even faster, just for the potential PR and all these convenience of okay, this is just a software-defined update. I don't know, John. I know people have been talking about that, and there's advantage of it. Do you think that would speed it up at all? If that?
Oh, look, what are the reasons why the automakers want to get to software-defined vehicles, which is an enabler to a user-defined vehicle? But getting back to the SDV over-the-air update thing, they can save a fortune. Fortune. Yeah. A couple of keystrokes, boom, the car's fixed. And that didn't work. Oh, here's another iteration. What did I just hear on After Hours yesterday? Tesla had to do 4 or 5 iterations of its latest quote unquote recall until it got it right. Yeah. And so the other thing is I can't remember the exact number, but something like 25% of all recalled vehicles never go back to the dealership. People just don't care. When General Motors had the ignition key switch thing, I mean, they were sending out people door to door, knocking on doors, please do this. And people, get the hell off my lawn. They didn't care. So that
is a much more practical and safer reason.
But you know what? If they get in an accident and they get damaged or hurt or whatever, you bet they're going to sue the car company. So just from that standpoint alone, an automaker is going to be, wow, if we can fix this without even having to tell people. Maybe legally we got to tell them, but that alone is why they'll want to do it.
And
well, it's a physical or digital recall. I mean, really. I mean, it's something like. I agree with you, Lauren, 100%. It is still a safety-focused element of why the government said we have to address this. And so I think that, in that way, do we ditch the word recall? No. But, I mean, as we just all discussed, it's like, yeah, but man, does that get clicks if it's got the T word in front of it and recall, and all of a sudden, pow, it turns into, how many eyeballs on your website.
I think the other thing, Chase, is over-the-air updates are not all equal across the automakers, right? Like,
that's something we can discuss too. Rivian and even Ford bricked a couple of their cars.
Tesla has it down, right? But there's still automakers that say, that software update, you need to take it to the dealer and have the dealer do it. And so maybe there needs to be a third component, right? Like, and that's sort of really my point, is that it's more than just, this like software update, just click yes on the app and it's all good. Because that may be for your car, but it may not be the one that your neighbor owns, right?
No, that is a great point. I've had software updates that have to go. I have to take the car in the dealership, and that to me is absurd. But
so it's like a remote recall or an in-person recall or something. Yeah, I mean, it's all about. I mean, what we're discussing now is the perceived inconvenience or convenience of what's happening with related to what is this recall, right? And if you can address it, and I think, as John pointed out, man, the cost savings that go along with, we can address that with software, and we know how to do it with software. That's huge, but the moment you inconvenience your customer further, that's the part where I think the argument is happening now with Tesla. It's like, yeah, I wasn't inconvenienced by this.
Right.
I literally, my car was in my garage, my phone went, and I looked at it, oh yeah, I'll download that software update. Sure, I'll go back to watching the game now. I didn't have to go anywhere, So I think it's that convenience factor that we're really mostly discussing, because at the end of the day, it's still about making the product more safe or better for the customer and the drivers, and in the end. But what did they have to do to resolve the problem that the OEM had identified?
Right. I mean, obviously Tesla's the big one that was in the news lately, but Rivian, Lucid, they've had these same things that solved over online. And I think it is, I think to your point, Lauren, too, the things that to me were really crazy that didn't get more attention was the software update Rivian sent out that then kind of prevented them not able to actually access the car. They could drive it, but they couldn't access the computer. Not good. And then the Ford one, which was really temporary, but it just stopped the car altogether. And to be realistic, there is pros and cons. Any technology has pros and cons. And for this over-the-air update, it's mostly good. But once again, it goes back to not having the right software know-how to execute it right. Is also something to be.
Yeah. One quick thing that I was thinking about, and Matt talks about this, I think in his sleep, right? But your question is about language, Chase. And fundamentally, it struck me as we were talking about this, that everything we've been talking about, EV charging, software, you go down the list, recalls, et cetera. It's both for the industry and the consumers and the regulatory agencies and the government, the states, and everybody. EVs are an entirely new product category and an entirely new language, right? And if we go back to the very beginning, early conversation, right? I had a cousin walk up years ago at Thanksgiving and looked at the Tesla. Oh, that's a hybrid, right? People just don't understand the language, right? And that's, that's Matt's whole reason for existence, right? Is we just have not done a good job in this industry. The automakers have failed at educating the consumers. It's spend $2 million on a humorous Super Bowl commercial, and it's no, that doesn't help people understand what an EV is and why they should buy it, right?
Well, as you're pointing out, the human element is the most important part of the discussion, and oftentimes it turns into, we hear right now, the market will demand that they want these products. And right now, the dealer argument with the 4,000 dealers that signed that letter to the Biden administration said, we don't think we're seeing that. We don't think we're seeing market demand. And we're seeing mandates. And even from a consumer perspective, we hear that we just go to any owners group, anything on social media related to EVs. How many people will you see? And I think John said earlier about, you will pry my V8 from my cold, dead fingers kind of thing. If they feel like something's being forced upon them, they will say, not all, but some might say, oh, I see why you're doing this out of altruism or something. Thank you, government. But it's all human factor.
Right.
They're not understanding what we're saying. Oftentimes they're not seeing the value because of how we aren't explaining it for what it does to benefit their lifestyle or their life. And it all comes down to, are they believing what they're hearing? And it is unfortunate that so often, and Lauren, I appreciate bringing it up, is how we communicate this, even the discussion of gas car, hybrid, plug-in hybrid, pure electric, that clearly didn't work. It's not resonating. It's not working. The idea of kilowatts to explain charging ain't working. Stop doing it. And so
charging ports.
What's that?
Yeah.
Ports, because everybody puts on a sailor's hat and they go to port when they go to I mean, just the level of lack of appreciation for communication.
J1772. Who thinks this up?
And it goes down, the list goes on. And I think that, if we land on that, you can build the greatest software in the world. You can build the best, most cool product in the world. But this is where people Steve Jobs, to his credit, he was difficult to work for, but he was one of those people that understood how to take that technology and translate it into something that you're going to see value in this. And it was the idea of we're not going to build what we think people are asking for. We're going to build what we understand they will want. And I don't know if that's happened a lot in the EV space. There's been a lot of that, well, again, Steve Jobs reference back in 97 when he was brought back to Apple and was asked, what have you been doing? And he said, we got two options. We can either sit down in a room with the engineers and ask them what kind of cool stuff can we come up with, do that, and then go try to figure out how to market it. Or we can ask, where do we take our customers? And that's what they built their entire product existence around. And I think that that's a big problem right now for how we're positioning EVs, because at brass tacks, end of the day, what are we discussing? It's a car still. It gets you from point A to point B. There are some fringe benefits around convenience by sake of you can fill up at home. But at the end of the day, how does it change people's lives? And right now they perceive it changes it in a negative way, even though those of us who drive EVs can say, it's not actually. It's phenomenal in all these ways. That's, as you point out, Lauren, that's all communication. That's all what that is. And it's been just dismissed by so many in the industry for the last 10 years. And it's just kind of baffling. I don't get it.
I agree. I think one thing, there's a lot I've learned today, but one thing I've clearly learned is we could talk about this all day.
Yeah.
Clearly we have some interests and passions about these topics in space. And so I figured what we should do before this, we've already broke the record. I think this is the longest podcast I've recorded, so we might have to break it into two parts. But let's real quickly, to kind of wrap this up, I'm just going to kick it off with kind of predictions I have for 2024. And then if we can just all go around and kind of maybe give any that stand out. Kind of in preparation for this, I was thinking one thing that we used to see, like when the Model S, like 2012, all that time, like one of the things we saw consistently was that battery and EV range was going up. Obviously, a lot of that was around innovation and efficiencies made in the cars, but a big part of it also was the actual chemistry and technology in the cells. And it's been interesting to me that we really haven't seen a lot of change in the last few years, essentially since the pandemic, around the supply chain side of that. And I think a big part was the demand. And now that we're kind of going back to a point where maybe EVs and cars aren't selling as fast, and I've even was talking to a supplier the other day about it, that one of the things that they're now selling this spring will have the same density for their LFP pack, and then the NMC version of this pack that they're selling, it's going to be 30% more dense, energy dense. And I think that is one of the big things that we're going to start seeing again, is now that there wasn't just such a crazy demand to get batteries, get cars, and that's starting to pull back. One of the areas that we're going to see more competitiveness is probably around still efficiency, but actually the energy density in the battery cells, which means lighter cars, go farther, yada, yada, yada. That's a hopeful, but one of my kind of predictions for 2024 to be competitive in the space. The second, I don't know if it's a prediction or it's kind of I want to wait and see whether the $7,500 credit that will be available at dealerships, while that's going to make it easier for people to take advantage, I don't know if that's going to be a huge motivator for people to now buy EVs. I think it might be marginal versus there's been a lot of excitement about that. And I think it's a good thing, but I really think it's going to be a marginal uptick versus like, oh, people are going to rush in to get that $7,500 like a cash for clunkers thing now that they don't have to deal with the IRS. The dealership deals with it. We'll see. But my second prediction is that's going to be a marginal improvement at best for EV sales this year. And then the third I had was, will the slowdown of the kind of EV sales, especially by the traditional OEMs like we've talked about, kind of pulling back from EVs and going to hybrids, is that really only going to be a successful short-term play for the automakers, or is that actually just going to kind of give fuel, put gas on the fire to the startups that are already all BEV in, and they can kind of just lean in, and you'll start seeing Tesla's market share start to go up again, which I think we did actually already last quarter. But Rivian and all these other startups that are just fully bought in on BEVs are really just going to be able to really take advantage and become known as the EV companies in the space. So that's my big three for 2024. And even an open question, I guess.
Let's talk about it first. So we've got the $7,500 tax credit. I agree with that take in the sense that they have, again, back to communication. They have to position it right. If you show the price of the vehicle and all of a sudden you say $7,500 cash off today, and it goes from $30,000 to 22,500 or something, that's a big deal. That's how people perceive benefit and value and savings. So and how the tax credit worked before was never actually something that people fundamentally understood, and you had to be in a certain tax bracket to really get some benefit out of it. So I don't disagree with you there. I think that how that's been communicated is still going to be a difficult selling point unless we change that. I think your point about batteries and energy, and energy density of the battery pack and innovation there. Do I think that's going to come out in 2024 as a big talking point? Where will we see some movement there? Hard to say. QuantumScape just had an announcement yesterday about how it was like 500,000 mile cycle they had on their pack they've been testing. So there's obvious movement there. I think what we're seeing is we're kind of stretching the limits of existing battery chemistry and technologies that we have, and the promise of solid state has been hanging out in the air now for what seems like forever.
Right.
And I think even if it was someone could announce that, hey, we've got like Toyota, we have a 600 mile range vehicle, isn't it great? Well, yeah, but when is it going to come to market and how fast? And then even when it does come to market, how does that marry to how you fill it up? Because there's still a lot of to unpack with that. So I think we've in a lot of ways, this conversation is kind of proving, I think we've exhausted a lot of the really great talking points that could come out of EV ownership. And I think it gets back to, are people perceiving value?
Right.
And, and I think that's a challenge right now that is not going to be solved by the battery technology that exists today or by another $7,500 off the car at the showroom, unfortunately. If I have a prediction for 2024, I think what we're going to start seeing is some realities around practical conversation around what does this product actually mean for people. Because there's been a ton of promises and already people are saying, you didn't live up to it, company XYZ. And I think that level of coming down to earth is going to be very real. But to your point, Chase, I think it's going to benefit brands like Tesla. I think they're still going to be able to say, we still stand out, and I don't know how that's going to be different this year. So this year, I don't think is going to be all that transformative, in my opinion, to be honest. Sorry to be a wet towel on that one.
No, I was going to joke and say, well, after almost 2 hours, that was the takeaway.
Yeah, that was the takeaway. Well, let's be clear. I mean, again, like our last conversation, not to not be optimistic, but there's a lack of pragmatism that has, again, not been applied to these conversations. The hype train has been going at 1,000 miles an hour on EVs for the last 5 to 6 years. And it's coming down to earth in a few ways. And I think that's good because at the end of the day, if you make promises you can't keep to the general public around what this will do for their life and they don't perceive value, well, then there's a stink that comes along with that product after a while. And that's not good. And that's where I always tell people from the EV, community, let's be very practical about how we position this. But don't say things that are ridiculous, like it takes me 10 seconds to charge my car because I plugged it in and walked in my house.
Right.
That's not what the general public is asking about, stuff like that. I think that's what we're seeing here is the practical applications of EVs, but we need to actually speak practically to the real benefits.
For sure.
And I think that's what this year is an opportunity for, because we're going to have to battle some of the negative things that have happened in the last few years.
For sure.
So.
John, Lauren, any thoughts or predictions for 2024?
Want to go next? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Wow, lots of things. So all the analysts are predicting that there's going to be a downturn in the automotive market in the U.S. next year. I do not agree because next year is a presidential election year. And it just so happens that in every presidential election year, car sales go great. I've just observed this over the years. So it should be a pretty good year. In fact, December came in really strong. Came in far stronger than the whole year for 2023. And I think that's probably an indication of a good kickoff to the year, especially if the Federal Reserve starts to lower interest rates, which,
Right.
It looks like it could do. That'll be an instant boon to car sales. I don't think the $7,500 automatic, at point of sale is going to make that much difference because a whole bunch of cars just got brushed off the list that they don't qualify
That's
for
a great
it.
point, yeah.
And so, but if you lease, you can get that money. And so my prediction is you're going to see a lot of EV lease deals getting advertised because that's where automakers are going to try to steer the consumer. But I think it's going to be a very tough year for EVs from this standpoint. The Republicans and Trump, the MAGA crowd especially, are on the warpath against EVs. And it really resonates with damn near half the car buying public. They don't believe in climate change. They think EVs are stupid. They think the government's trying to shove it down their throat. They don't think these things should be subsidized. So I don't know if it's a plank of the platform of the Republican Party, but it's definitely a talking point. And so I think you're going to see the anti-EV megaphones really cranked up in 2024. So, like I said, I think overall for the industry, my gut feel is it's going to be pretty good. I believe EV sales will continue to grow. We'll do better than what we did in 2023 because there's so many more new models coming out in different market segments, different price points from different brands. And there's, a rule of law in the automotive industry, an inviolable law. Every car that gets built gets sold. They don't take them apart at the end of the year and send the components back to the suppliers. Every single one gets sold. Now, it might not sell in the time frame they want. They may not make a profit on it, but every one gets sold. So as more EVs get sold, EV sales are going to go up.
Right. I guess that's me. So a couple things. Basically, I agree with all of you on the $7,500 tax credit. I've done a lot of analysis over the years using actual IRS data on who is actually filing when you actually had to file your tax return for it. And it was mostly high income people. And I know the people on the left side don't like to hear that because it's talking points for Republicans and conservatives, but fundamentally it's true. The people that buy EVs and use the tax credit are, modest income and higher income people. And so the tax credit and the dealer rebate, et cetera, I think will have a modest impact. But fundamentally, people either are interested in buying an EV or they're not. And so the tax credit, I believe, has always been more of a discount than it actually has been a driver of incremental sales. But I do think that the rebate aspect, the point of sale aspect will help a little bit, but 100% agree with John. I'm on my third lease of Tesla. I fundamentally believe that leasing an EV is better because of the ongoing improvement of the technology. I mean, the car's range improves 10%, 15% every 18 months, 20%, whatever it is. The hardware gets better, the software gets better. I just think it makes sense to lease an EV rather than buy one. And then you add in the tax credit. You can get a $160,000 Lucid and get the $7,500 credit if you lease it, right? So why not lease, right? So this could be a year of the market finally wakes up that leasing is not a bad idea, that actually for EVs, maybe it's actually the better approach. So we could see a growth in leasing this year. On the battery aspect, Chase, I think one of the interesting things has been is how Ford had the NMC Lightning and the LFP Lightning. So 300 miles of range, 230 miles of range, different price points. And I think that bifurcation is probably going to only increase, and that the automakers realize that in order for EV sales to grow, they actually have to be more affordable. And that more and more people, especially experienced EV owners, realize they actually don't need 400 miles of range. In that, 250 actually works for most people, right? And so I think understanding, just like you have models that have a V6 and a V8, et cetera, people will realize that, this will work for me.
Well, I think just to kind of hop in on the LFP thing real quick, I think,
but then the last,
I think a lot of people didn't expect LFP to be so popular so quickly, and it really is the easy button for new EV drivers. They don't have to worry about charging it to a certain percentage.
Yeah.
It just, they can charge it 100 every time. I really think you're right that that's
and then of course
really,
they don't burn.
Yeah, and we've got sodium coming, which is already here, so we don't have to wait for the solid state because sodium is already in some of the Chinese EVs as of right now, and that's going to be a game changer as well. But in the interest of time, moving on, the other sort of my predictions are. We could see actually sort of a return of plug-in hybrid sales, mostly driven by Toyota, of course, because they've hitched their pony to regular hybrids and plug-in hybrids. The problem with Toyota is they're just not making very many plug-in hybrids. They're all made in Japan, and they're not bringing enough over here. I've talked to executives at Toyota, and whether you believe them or not, they've told me they just don't have enough batteries. For like the RAV4 and stuff like that. And so hopefully they get that fixed. But I know Kia and Hyundai still believe strongly in plug-in hybrids. They believe that the middle of the country is not ready for BEVs. And so they're playing the multi-powertrain platform, and they have some, good plug-in hybrids. They have 30, 35, 40 miles of range. And so again, I could be wrong on this, but we could see a spurt of growth in plug-in hybrids this year. I agree with John also that a lot of people are predicting a down year in EV sales, but I think, we also have to realize that a lot of people are on their second and third EV, right? So we have this existing market of people are turning in their leases and getting another EV, and that foundation is growing significantly. So we'll probably see a modest growth overall in EV sales this year. And then the last thing, my sort of big thing that I've been harping on about on LinkedIn a lot the last 6 months is 2024 is going to be kind of an ugly year in the charging space. I think we're going to see a shakeout and a bloodbath, and a lot more bankruptcies and mergers and consolidation and stuff. This is the 1849 gold rush, right? And there are too many people that moved to California to try to get rich with DC fast charging. And there's just not enough gold in the ground, right? Like as I like to say, we may add between 13,500 to 15,000 fast charging ports, Matt, this year. Like 60 some percent of those will be Tesla chargers, right? And so 80 to 90% are going to be manufactured, the hardware manufactured by 4 to 5 manufacturers. But we have like 100 companies that have entered the fast charging hardware space. The math doesn't work, right? The pie isn't big enough. So I won't mention their names because they're all my clients, but there are several of these companies that are already, in trouble and seeking investors, and it could be a very ugly year in the charging space.
Well, I think that will be just one more thing to follow you on LinkedIn about. I find a lot of the time you always have some pretty interesting posts around that, and I'm sure there'll be some big surprises coming this year. So I just want to say, having gone over time, thank you so much, everyone, for being a part of this, and for I think just continuing to come on the podcast and share your thoughts. This has been, I think, probably one of the more fascinating, just having even a little difference in opinion occasionally. I think it turned out we all agreed on in the end, but just having those conversations and really kind of recapping this past year and looking forward to 2024, I think for anyone who is in kind of the EV or sustainable space, there's a lot to look forward for this year. There's definitely some gray clouds in the distance, especially around the political side of stuff come up this year, as you kind of even mentioned, John. But I think it's going to be exciting either way. So I just want to say thank you all for joining, and looking forward to having you all on again soon.
Great. Thanks, Chase.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Chase.
Thank you for joining us on this two-part journey looking back with our panel, The Standout Moments for Electric Vehicles in 2023. I hope today's discussion on the impact of Chinese electric vehicles on global auto markets, the growing role of software, consumer preferences for user-defined vehicles, the challenges faced by legacy automakers in software integration, and the communication hurdles EV automakers face in engaging with the public has provided you with a deeper understanding and fresh insights. Our panel's predictions for 2024 have also undoubtedly given you much to think about regarding the future trends and developments in the electric vehicle sector. Also, check out part 1 of our panel as well if you haven't already, where we discuss the impacts of the North American Charging Standard and how the rollout of the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Funds changed the electric vehicle charging space in 2023. We also discuss the growth rate of electric vehicle sales and how legacy automakers have been responding to the sales in the auto market and also changing where they're putting investments for different types of powertrains, whether that be a fully electric vehicle or for a lot of the legacy automakers, kind of taking a step back and reinvesting more into plug-in hybrids and hybrid technology. Plus, don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform to stay updated with the latest in electric vehicle news and discussions. Please also be aware that we are growing this podcast, and positive ratings and reviews really do help Grid Connections grow so we can keep bringing you more episodes like today. Share this episode with your network to spread the word about the exciting developments in the industry, and your support helps us continue to bring your expert insights and in-depth analysis of the ever-changing world of electric vehicles and how they tie to our grid. If this episode generated any questions or comments on what you want to have discussed more, please share them with the comments section on our YouTube page or reach out to us on Twitter, where you can share your suggestions or even recommendations for future guests. Join us next time on the Grid Connections podcast, where we will continue to explore the cutting-edge innovations and challenges in the electric vehicle market. Until next week, remember, whether you're a seasoned EV enthusiast or new to the world of electric mobility, the Grid Connections podcast is your go-to source for all things that tie to the grid. Thank you.